AutomationEdge is building delightful workplace experiences. You can quickly map your business or IT processes to AutomationEdge workflows with its innumerable pre-built actions or steps. This video displays the advanced REST client step to consume RESTful services. Let us describe the advanced REST client step. It is a step in the utility category for Process Studio workflows. The advanced REST client step enables you to consume RESTful services by making REST calls. You can configure the advanced REST client with the following options. Select an HTTP method and provide the HTTP URL for the RESTful services. Provide the request timeout to connect with the remote host. Provide the SSL authentication configuration, or there is an option to ignore the SSL certificate validation. You can provide an authenticated proxy configuration. Enter the request URL parameters if any. Provide HTTP authorization for protected resources. Provide the request headers for the REST API and the request body. The step provides 8 different ways to enter the request body. You can capture the HTTP response headers and output fields. You can test your REST API. Now let us go to Process Studio to see the advanced REST client step configuration options in details. I'm in Process Studio. I have created a blank workflow. Let us search for the advanced REST client step. Let me drag and drop it on the canvas. Let me double click it. Before I explain each of the configuration options, let me create a contextual workflow. Let us cancel for now. We will create a workflow to execute an AutomationEdge workflow using AutomationEdge Execute Workflow REST API. For this purpose, we will need 2 advanced REST client steps. The first one to execute the AutomationEdge Authentication REST API, and the second one to execute the AutomationEdge Execute Workflow REST API. So let me drag and drop 2 advanced REST client steps. Now I want to pass the AutomationEdge server URL, credentials, my user account org code, and the workflow to execute as parameters. So first of all, let us double click the canvas. Let us go to the parameters tab to define the parameters. The first is AutomationEdge URL. Description is AutomationEdge URL. It is of the type string. We can set runtime false so that we just have to configure it once as a configuration parameter. And let me provide a default value. Next, let us define AutomationEdge server credentials. The description is AutomationEdge server credentials. It is of the type credential, and this also can be a configuration parameter. Let us provide the default values. I've entered the username and password. Click OK. Next, let me define AE server org code. The description is AE server org code. It is of the type string, and let me provide value for my org code. And lastly, let me define a parameter workflow name. I have provided a description. It is of the type string, and in this case the runtime parameter, let us set it to true, as we want the user to be able to select the workflow to execute at runtime. Let me provide a default value. I'll provide one of the workflows on my AutomationEdge instance, that is audit log. So click OK. Now let us start with a get variable step. Let me double click. So the first variable we need is the URL, that is AE URL. Let us give a field name, AE URL, and the format, length, and other details, we'll keep it to the default. The next variable is AutomationEdge server credentials username and AutomationEdge credentials password. So let us provide a field name, AE username, and AE password. The next variable is the AE server org code. So let me create a field, AE org code. And finally, the workflow name. So workflow name, let me call the field as workflow name. Click OK. Now we wish to define the AutomationEdge Authentication REST API and execute a workflow REST API URLs. Let me drag and drop a modified JavaScript step. Let us rename it as per the convention. We'll write the abbreviation for the step. Let us call it REST URLs. In this script, I have defined two variables. The first one is for authenticate URL, which is the AutomationEdge URL followed by AE Engine REST Authenticate. And the second variable is execute workflow URL, which is the AutomationEdge URL followed by AE Engine REST Execute. Now let us define these variables as fields to return from the step. The first is authentication URL and the second is the execute workflow URL. Let us click OK and let us connect it to the first advanced REST client step as the main output. And after the first advanced REST client for authentication, we need a JSON input step to fetch the session token from the HTTP response of the advanced REST client step. So let me search for a JSON input step and place it after the first advanced REST client step, and let me connect it to the second step. Now we can configure the first advanced REST client step. Let us double click. The first is the step name. Please specify the name of the step as you would like it to appear in the workflow workspace. This name has to be unique in a single workflow. Let me write the step abbreviation followed by AutomationEdge Authentication. You can select how the step will interact with the resource. The HTTP method options include get to retrieve a resource, put to create or update an existing resource, delete to delete a resource, post to create a new resource, head to retrieve only header information from the resource, options to describe other methods and operations supported by the server, and patch to make partial updates on a resource. Let us select the post method. You can type your REST resource HTTP URL, or you can click on the checkbox to get the URL from a field. We earlier created the authenticate URL, so let us select it from the list. Now let us see the tabs one by one. First is the settings tab, and the first field is request timeout in seconds. It has a default value 60 seconds. You can specify another value, or you can also select a field containing the time in seconds. It is the time to establish the connection with the remote host of the REST client resource. Let us leave it to the default. The next is SSL configuration. In this section, you can provide authentication details for accessing a resource that requires SSL certificate authentication. The first option is ignore SSL certificate validation. You can enable this checkbox to ignore SSL certificate verification while making an HTTPS connection. However, this will entirely ignore the certificate checking, making it insecure. So use it only when it makes sense. Else, provide or browse for the trust store file in case of HTTPS connections and specify the trust store password. For the purposes of this video, I will click on Ignore SSL Certificate Verification. The next section is Proxy Configuration. The first is the Use System Proxy checkbox. You can enable the checkbox to allow the REST client to use the Process Studio's default proxy configurations. Or in case of AutomationEdge Agent, it uses the AutomationEdge Agent's proxy configurations. Else, you can provide the other details. Select proxy server type from the list. Specify the name or IP of the proxy host if proxy authentication is required. Specify the port number of the proxy host. In case of authenticated proxy server, provide the username and the password. For now, I'm not connecting through proxy, so I'll leave the options blank. Let us go to the second tab. Here you can provide the request URL parameters. In the parameter key, specify the request parameter keys. In the parameter value, specify the parameter key values. And in the description, specify a description for the parameter. Now for our AutomationEdge Authentication REST API, we need to define two parameter keys as per the AutomationEdge Authentication REST API. You can check it in the AutomationEdge API documentation. The first one is username, and the parameter value is the AE username that we defined earlier. The second is password, and it comes from the AE password field. Click OK. Let us go to the third tab. When your RESTful resource is protected, in this section, you can provide the credentials that authenticate a user to the server to allow access to the protected resource. First of all, select an authentication type from the list, such as no authentication, basic authentication. In the case of basic authentication, provide the username and password, or you can select bearer token. The bearer authentication is an HTTP authentication scheme that involves security tokens called bearer tokens to give access to the bearer of this token. So provide the token, or you can select OAuth 2.0. It is an industry standard protocol for authorization. So the purpose is not authentication, but to grant access to a set of resources. In case of OAuth 2.0, provide the configuration options. Select the grant type, that is client credentials or password credentials. In case of client credentials, you can provide the other details such as access token URL, client ID, client secret and scope, and client authentication such as send as basic authentication header or send client credentials in the body. And for the advanced options, you can provide the resource and the audience for authorization. In case of password credentials, you need to provide the access token URL, client ID, client secret, username and password. And for advanced options, you can provide the audience for authorization. For now, I will leave the HTTP authorization to NoAuth. Now let us go to the headers tab. You can provide request headers. In the header key, specify a header key, specify a header value, or you can get the header value from a field and specify a description of the header. Now for the AutomationEdge Authentication API, there are no header keys to pass, hence let us leave it blank. You can check the API details in the AutomationEdge API documentation. For the request body, you can choose from 8 options to pass the request body. First of all is none when you don't have to pass any request body. The next option is raw. In the right navigation pane, you can select the raw request body type such as text, HTML, XML, JSON or XML. You can specify the request body in the right pane. You could insert fields from the left navigation pane by double-clicking the field. Else use a template support in the request body to substitute fields and environment variables or parameters in appropriate placeholders for field name or environment variable. The next, you can specify a request body using form data. You can enter the request body in a tabular format in a form to send non-ASCII text or large binary data. In the key type column, you can select the form data parameter key type such as text or file from the drop-down list. In the key column, specify the form data parameter key. In the value column, specify the form data parameter value. Else you can select a field containing the form data parameter value and specify a description for the form data parameter string. For the authentication API, let us leave it null. You can also specify the request body as XWWW form URL encoded. You can enter the request body in the tabular format. Use the XWWW form URL encoded request body type to send simple text or ASCII data. In the key column, specify a parameter key, specify a parameter value, and a description for the parameter. The next option is read from file, to read the request body from a file. In the first file path field, select the content type for the request body from text, HTML, XML, JSON, XML. In the file path, specify the request body file path. You can click on the View Request Body Contents to view the request body file contents. The next option is Read from Field, to read the request body text from a field. In the field name, the first option is to select the content type of the request body, and in the next field you can select the field to read the request body raw text. The next option is binary, to read the request body from a binary file. You can browse for the binary file path. And lastly, the GraphQL. GraphQL is an open source data query language and data manipulation language for APIs and a query runtime engine. In the query pane, you can specify a GraphQL query to read or fetch values, or a mutation to write or post values. In the GraphQL variables pane, insert the variables and the respective values to help factor dynamic values out of the query and pass them as a separate dictionary. You could also insert fields in the query and GraphQL variables from the navigator on the left by double-clicking the field. Else you can also use a template support in the request body to substitute fields and environment variables or parameters in appropriate placeholders for field name or environment variable. Please make sure when assigning a field or environment variable to a string, we have to explicitly enclose the value in double quotes. Please note that the Advanced REST Client GraphQL does not support subscription queries. There is no request body for the AutomationEdge Authentication API, so we'll leave all the options blank. And finally, the last tab, HTTP response, to capture the response from the REST call. The first field is the response status. Specify an output field to hold the HTTP response status. The default value is ARC response status. Next, specify an output field to hold the HTTP response time in milliseconds. The default field name is ARC response time. Next, specify an output field to hold the HTTP response headers in JSON format. The default field name is ARC response headers. Next, specify a field name to hold the HTTP response cookies in JSON format. The default value is ARC response cookies. Next, specify an output field to hold the HTTP response body text, if any. The default field name is ARC response body. And in the output file, specify a field name to hold the file path for the file received in the HTTP response. The default field name is ARC response output file. And finally, the add file to result checkbox. Check this option to add the HTTP response output file to the workflow result. For this REST API, let us leave it unchecked. And in the response body, I wish to specify result. Click OK. Now let us go to the next step, that is JSON input. In this step, we wish to read the response body, that is the result field, from the Advanced REST Client step, and we wish to read the session token from the response body. So let me call this step session token, and the source is from a previous step, and I want to read the result. Now in the fields tab, I want to generate an output field, session token, and I want it to read the value of the session token in the result body. Let us click OK. And finally, let us go to the second Advanced REST Client step. We will execute the AutomationEdge Execute Workflow API from this step. So let me call it Execute Workflow. Now I wish to create a new workflow. So I will select the post method, and we will get the URL that we defined earlier, that is execute workflow URL. Now I will not explain all the fields in detail as we have already discussed them. So in the settings tab, I do not wish to set any SSL or proxy configuration. Let us directly go to the headers tab. For the headers and the request body, you can refer to the AutomationEdge API documentation. In the header, we need to specify the content type, that is application JSON, and we want to define a header key X session token, and the value is coming from a field, that is session token. It will be used to log into the AutomationEdge to execute the workflow. In the request body, we will select raw, and let me provide the request body. So I have copied the request body template from the API documentation, and let me replace the placeholders. So org code in my case is AE org code. So at runtime, it will get the field value from the incoming fields, and the workflow name is the same as the incoming field. Now let us go to the response tab. So the first is the response status. We have already used the ARCA response status field name earlier in the first Advanced REST Client step. So let me prepend and execute in front of the field name. Similarly, I'll do this for the others. Now in the response body, I want to capture it as result. So this completes the configuration for the execute workflow. Click OK. Save your workflow. So when I execute the workflow, it will connect to the AutomationEdge URL provided in the parameters. and it will execute a workflow with the name audit log, as we have set it as the default value. So let me run the workflow. Click run. As you can see, the workflow is complete. You can go to the preview tab and you can see the response from the AutomationEdge Authentication Advanced REST Client step. You can also see the session token is fetched by the JSON Input session token step, and the response is OK. Now let us go to the AutomationEdge UI. I have logged into the AutomationEdge portal. Let me go to the requests menu, and you can see the audit log workflow is successfully executed. You can also publish this workflow on AutomationEdge portal. I have published execute workflow to the AutomationEdge portal. I can execute it from the catalog and provide the runtime parameters. That is the name of the workflow I wish to execute. So I have entered audit log workflow. Let me submit the request. Let us go to the requests menu, and you can see it has created a new request for the audit log and it has successfully completed the request. Let us recap. We saw the advanced REST client, step, description, and configuration options. You can jumpstart your digital transformation journey with AutomationEdge's conversational AI and hyperautomation platforms.